Natalie Thompson had always taken pride in her role as a pastor's wife. For over 2 decades, she had stood by Mark's side, supporting his ministry and dedicating herself to their small-town church community. Their lives revolved around faith, fellowship, and the responsibilities that came with Mark's position. From organizing church events to leading women's prayer groups, Natalie poured her heart into serving others. But lately, something about their marriage felt different. Mark had always been a busy man, but in recent months, his schedule seemed even more demanding. He was staying late at the church more frequently, citing planning meetings and counseling sessions. Natalie was used to his long hours, but there was a newfound intensity in his commitment that didn't sit right with her. He had also started paying more attention to his appearance, buying new clothes, getting regular haircuts, and even changing his cologne. Natalie initially thought he was just trying to stay fresh and professional, but deep down, she couldn't help but feel that something was off. The feeling only deepened one Sunday after the morning service. While Natalie was chatting with members of the congregation, a teenage girl approached her, smiling innocently as she mentioned seeing Pastor Mark and Sylvia at a coffee shop earlier in the week. The girl giggled, saying how cute they looked together. Natalie forced a smile and nodded, but inside, her heart sank. Sylvia Robbins was a bright and talented 25-year-old choir singer who had recently become more involved in the church. Mark had spoken highly of her dedication, but Natalie had never thought much of it until now. That evening, as Natalie prepared dinner, she found herself replaying the girl's words over and over. Mark had never mentioned going out for coffee with Sylvia. He had always been open about his schedule, often telling Natalie who he was meeting and what it was about. But lately, his updates had been vague, just general mentions of meetings and church-related tasks. Natalie brushed it off as her imagination running wild, but a nagging feeling settled deep in her chest. In the following weeks, Natalie couldn't help but notice the small details that had previously escaped her. Mark was spending more time on his phone, responding to messages with a level of focus she hadn't seen before. When she walked into her room, he would quickly put it down or turn the screen away. It wasn't just his behavior that concerned her. It was his emotional distance. Conversations that once flowed naturally now felt strained and distracted, as if he was only half listening. Natalie had always trusted Mark implicitly, but doubt was beginning to creep in. She watched as he lingered after choir rehearsals, staying behind long after the other members had left. Sylvia was always there too, chatting with him in the corner of the church hall, their conversations punctuated with laughter and smiles. Natalie told herself it was just ministry, but she couldn't shake the uneasy feeling that Sylvia was becoming more than just another church member to Mark. One afternoon, while tidying up the house, Natalie came across Mark's laundry. As she folded his shirts, she noticed a faint floral scent clinging to the fabric. It wasn't her perfume, and Mark had never been one to wear scented products. Natalie hesitated, holding the shirt in her hands for a moment before placing it back in the basket. It was another thing to add to the growing list of little changes she had noticed. As weeks went by, Natalie's mind raced with possibilities. She considered confiding in her close friend Linda, but something held her back. She didn't want to believe that Mark, the man she had built a life with, could be hiding something from her. Instead, she prayed for clarity and pushed forward, convincing herself that it was all in her head. After all, Mark had never given her any real reason to doubt him before. Despite her efforts to stay positive, Natalie's suspicions only grew stronger. She started paying closer attention to Mark's schedule, noticing how often he mentioned needing to stay late to prepare sermons or meet with church members. It wasn't unusual, but now, with the added context of Sylvia's presence, it all seemed too convenient. Natalie also began observing Sylvia more closely during services and events. She noticed how Sylvia's eyes always seemed to find Mark in a crowded room, how she laughed a little too enthusiastically at his jokes, and how she lingered nearby whenever he was speaking. It wasn't overt, but Natalie could sense the subtle undercurrents of attraction. One evening, as Natalie sat alone in their living room, she found herself staring at the family photos on the mantel, pictures of their wedding day, their early years together, and church events over the years stared back at her. The thought of losing everything they had built together was unbearable. She couldn't shake the feeling that if she didn't get to the bottom of things soon, their marriage would slip through her fingers. Natalie decided she needed to find answers. She began subtly asking Mark more questions about his schedule, carefully watching his reactions. He responded with his usual charm, but there was something in his eyes that made Natalie uneasy, an underlying tension she hadn't noticed before. As much as she wanted to dismiss it, Natalie could no longer ignore the signs. Something was happening between Mark and Sylvia, and whether or not she was ready to face it, the truth was beginning to reveal itself in ways she couldn't deny. Natalie's suspicions continued to grow, creeping into every corner of her mind like an unwelcome guest. Mark had always been a busy man, but now his routine seemed to shift in ways she couldn't ignore. He was spending more time at the church than usual, often slipping away for late meetings or impromptu counseling sessions. Natalie noticed that he had started taking phone calls in private, retreating to his study with the door shut or stepping outside when she was around. When she asked him about it, he would give vague explanations, brushing off her concerns with a tired smile and an affectionate pat on the shoulder. But Natalie could see the cracks forming. He was becoming more distant, his focus elsewhere. Sylvia's presence only made things worse. She had always been involved in church activities, but now she was around more than ever. Whether it was helping organize events, offering to lead small group discussions, or simply stopping by their home with questions for Mark, Sylvia had found countless reasons to stay close. Natalie tried to convince herself it was innocent. Sylvia was young and eager to serve, but there was something about the way she lingered when Mark was around, the way her eyes lit up when he spoke, that made Natalie uneasy. Sylvia's friendly demeanor felt calculated, almost too perfect. Whenever she visited, she'd make an effort to compliment Natalie on her hospitality or praise Mark for his dedication, always positioning herself as an ally. But Natalie sensed something deeper beneath the surface, a subtle shift in the way Sylvia's presence altered the atmosphere in their home. It was in the way Mark's posture changed when Sylvia was near, the way he suddenly seemed more attentive, more engaged. It made Natalie feel like an outsider in her own marriage. One evening, after Sylvia had dropped by unexpectedly to discuss an upcoming church event, Natalie confronted Mark. She asked him, point blank, if there was anything going on between him and Sylvia. Mark's reaction was immediate. His face tightened, and his voice took on a defensive edge. He accused Natalie of being insecure, of not trusting him after all their years together. He insisted that Sylvia was just a mentee, someone he was guiding in her spiritual journey, and nothing more. His words should have reassured Natalie, but they didn't. The way he said it, the way he avoided eye contact, made her feel like she was being dismissed rather than comforted. Later that night, as Natalie lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, doubt gnawed at her. She thought about how easily Mark had brushed off her concerns, how quickly he had turned the conversation back on her, making her feel like the one in the wrong. It wasn't like him to be so defensive, and that in itself was a red flag. Natalie needed someone to talk to, someone who could give her perspective, so she turned to her best friend, Linda. Over coffee the next morning, Natalie confided in Linda, laying out all the little things that had been bothering her. Mark's sudden secrecy, his changing routine, and Sylvia's constant presence. Linda listened patiently, then smiled reassuringly. She reminded Natalie of how dedicated Mark had always been to the church and how he had never given her a reason to doubt him before. She suggested that maybe Natalie was reading too much into things, letting her imagination get the best of her. Mark is a good man, Linda said, squeezing Natalie's hand. You have to trust him. Natalie nodded, forcing a smile, but deep down, her gut told her otherwise. There were too many unanswered questions, too many things that didn't add up. She decided to keep a closer watch on Mark, to pay attention to the details he thought she wasn't noticing. Her patience was tested when Mark began leaving earlier in the mornings and coming home later in the evenings. Natalie tried to act normal, going about her usual tasks, but the nagging feeling wouldn't leave her. One afternoon, as she cleaned out the back seat of Mark's car, she found something that made her stomach drop. Tucked beneath the passenger seat was a second phone, one she had never seen before. Natalie's hands trembled as she stared at the device. It was sleek and modern, completely unlike the phone Mark used daily. Her mind raced with questions. Why would he need another phone? What was he hiding? She considered turning it on, but fear held her back. Instead, She carefully placed it back where she found it, feeling the weight of her suspicions solidify into something undeniable. For the rest of the day, Natalie felt like she was floating through her routine, her mind consumed with the discovery. Mark had never mentioned having a second phone, and there was no reason she could think of for him to need one, except for something he didn't want her to know. That night, as she watched him from across the dinner table, she wondered how much of their life together had become a lie. Natalie debated whether or not to confront Mark about the phone, but decided against it for now. If he was keeping secrets, she needed to be careful. She couldn't risk tipping him off until she had more proof. Instead, she started paying attention to when and where he used his phone, noticing the moments he slipped away to take calls, or when he conveniently left his usual phone behind while going on errands. As days passed, Natalie's mind became consumed with the possibility that everything she had feared was true. The little moments that once felt insignificant now seemed glaring. Sylvia's lingering gazes, Mark's quick dismissals, and the way he always seemed distracted. The weight of her doubts pressed heavily on her, but Natalie knew one thing for certain. She needed to get to the bottom of it. Natalie's mind refused to rest. The doubts that had been gnawing at her for weeks now felt too heavy to ignore. Determined to uncover the truth, she found herself attending church events she normally would have skipped, Bible study groups, volunteer meetings, even casual gatherings. She watched Mark and Sylvia closely, observing their interactions with a sharpened focus. The way they stood just a little too close, the way Sylvia's eyes lingered on him during conversations, and the private moments they stole together. It all left Natalie feeling sick to her stomach. At first, she tried to push away the thoughts, telling herself that Sylvia was just an eager member of the congregation and that Mark was simply being a supportive mentor. But it didn't take long before Natalie noticed other subtle signs. Mark's newfound attentiveness to his appearance, the way he kept his phone face down on the table, and the long nights at the church that no longer seemed to add up. She wanted to believe that it was all in her head, but something told her it wasn't. Sylvia's presence in their lives became more frequent. She was always around, offering to help with church events, volunteering to assist Mark with his sermons, or stopping by their house under the guise of discussing church activities. Each time Sylvia walked through their front door, Natalie felt like an intruder in her own home. Sylvia's charm and enthusiasm were hard to resist, but Natalie couldn't shake the feeling that there was something more beneath the surface, something that everyone else was too blind to see. Late one night, after another long day of smiling through her growing doubts, Natalie lay in bed staring at the ceiling while Mark slept beside her. She could hear his steady breathing, but her mind raced with questions. Unable to resist, she quietly reached over and picked up his phone from the nightstand. Her hands trembled as she scrolled through his notifications. Her heart pounded as she noticed Sylvia's name appearing over and over, innocuous messages about church meetings and planning sessions, but there was something in the tone that unsettled her. The messages weren't outright suspicious, but the frequency and familiarity of them made Natalie feel uneasy. She quickly placed the phone back, careful not to wake him, and lay back down, her mind spinning with possibilities. Trying to find another explanation, Natalie turned to the church's social media page the next morning. As she scrolled through posts, she noticed a pattern. Sylvia's name was everywhere. She liked every photo Mark was in, commented enthusiastically on his posts, and shared his sermons with captions that felt too personal. The attention Sylvia gave Mark was far beyond admiration for a pastor. It felt possessive. Natalie decided to confide in her best friend, Linda, hoping for some clarity. Over coffee at their usual spot, she laid out her concerns, from the late nights to Sylvia's constant presence. Linda listened patiently, but shook her head. "Natalie, I think you're overthinking this. Mark is a good man. He's devoted to the church and to you. Sylvia's just enthusiastic. Maybe she looks up to him, but that doesn't mean anything's happening." Natalie wanted to believe Linda, but deep down, her instincts told her otherwise. She had known Mark for too long, and the changes in his behavior were too glaring to ignore. The way he dodged questions about Sylvia, the defensiveness in his voice whenever she brought it up, something wasn't right. A few nights later, Natalie found herself alone in the house. Mark had left for another late meeting, and she couldn't shake the feeling that it was a lie. On impulse, She decided to check his car for anything out of the ordinary. She opened the glove compartment and sifted through receipts, old church programs, and loose papers. Then, tucked between the pages of a church bulletin, she found it, a second phone. Natalie's breath caught in her throat as she stared at the unfamiliar device. Why would Mark need another phone? Her hands trembled as she turned it over in her hands. She debated turning it on but decided against it. Instead, she carefully placed it back where she found it and closed the glove compartment, feeling her chest tighten with dread. For the next few days, Natalie watched Mark more closely than ever. She tracked his routine, noticing how often he left the house without explanation and how frequently Sylvia seemed to pop up in conversation. Every little sign pushed her further toward the conclusion she didn't want to face. Mark was having an affair. But Natalie needed more than just suspicion. She needed undeniable proof. One evening, she decided to follow him. She waited until he left for his meeting, giving him a few minutes before grabbing her coat and car keys. Her heart pounded as she tailed him through the streets of Columbus, staying far enough behind to avoid suspicion. Instead of driving to the church, Mark continued past it, heading toward the other side of town. Natalie's stomach churned as she watched him pull into an apartment complex she didn't recognize. She parked at a distance and watched as he got out of the car, walked to the building, and entered without hesitation. Natalie sat frozen, staring at the door that had swallowed her husband. She sat there for what felt like an eternity, her fingers gripping the steering wheel so tightly that her knuckles turned white. The sight of him walking so casually into Sylvia's apartment complex confirmed everything she had feared. He hadn't even hesitated, hadn't even checked to see if anyone was watching. Natalie felt an overwhelming wave of betrayal wash over her, leaving her breathless. After a while, Mark emerged from the building, looking calm and collected as he got back into his car. Natalie watched him drive off, tears stinging her eyes. He had lied to her, again and again, and now she had proof. When she arrived home that night, Natalie sat in the dark living room, her mind racing. She thought about the years they had spent together, the sacrifices she had made to support his ministry, and the trust that had been shattered beyond repair. There was no denying it anymore. Mark was cheating on her with Sylvia. Natalie's hands clenched into fists as anger simmered beneath the surface. She wasn't just hurt. She was furious. How could he throw away everything they had built together? How could he betray her and their vows so easily? The house felt different now, empty and cold. Natalie stared at the clock, knowing that when Mark walked through the door later, things would never be the same again. Natalie's patience was wearing thin. The late nights, the secretive glances between Mark and Sylvia, the way he seemed to pull further away from her with each passing day, it was all becoming too much. She had always been the supportive wife, the woman who stood by Mark through every challenge, every hardship, and every triumph. But now, she felt like an outsider in her own marriage, watching helplessly as it unraveled right before her eyes. That morning, as Mark rushed out the door for yet another urgent meeting at the church, Natalie stood by the window, watching his car disappear down the street. She sighed, feeling that all too familiar knot tightening in her stomach. She needed answers. She needed something tangible to confront him with, something he couldn't explain away with his usual charm and excuses. Later that day, while organizing the garage, Natalie noticed Mark's car keys on the counter. Her heart pounded as she stared at them, knowing this was an opportunity she couldn't ignore. Glancing around to make sure she was alone, she grabbed the keys and walked to his car. The interior smelled faintly of his cologne, but there was something else, something floral and unfamiliar. She searched the glove compartment, the center console, and finally, the passenger seat. As she ran her hand under the seat, her fingers brushed against something small and metallic. Pulling it out, Natalie's breath caught in her throat. It was a delicate gold bracelet, one she had never seen before. A tiny charm dangled from it, engraved with the initials E.M. Sylvia Robbins. Natalie's knees weakened, and she had to steady herself against the car door. Her mind raced, trying to rationalize what she had just found. Maybe it wasn't Sylvia's, maybe it belonged to a church member who had borrowed Mark's car for an errand. But deep down, she knew the truth. This wasn't an accident. This was evidence. When Mark returned home that evening, Natalie was waiting for him in the kitchen, the bracelet laid out on the counter. He barely glanced at her before setting down his briefcase and heading for the fridge. "Mark," she said firmly, her voice steady despite the storm brewing inside her. "Whose is this?" He looked up, his eyes darting to the bracelet before quickly looking away. "What? I don't know. Where did you find that?" His voice was calm, but Natalie could see the tension in his jaw, the way his hand gripped the fridge door a little too tightly. "I found it in your car," she replied, watching his reaction closely. "It's Sylvia's, isn't it?" Mark let out a nervous chuckle, shaking his head. "Natalie, come on. You're overthinking this. Sylvia must have left it there after a ride to one of the church events. It's nothing." Natalie's eyes narrowed. "Why was she even in your car in the first place? And don't tell me it's nothing, Mark. I know something's going on." Mark sighed, rubbing his temples. "Natalie, you're being paranoid. I've told you, Sylvia is just a member of the church. She's been helping a lot with events, and sometimes I give her a ride. That's it." Natalie wasn't buying it. "Then why didn't you mention it before? Why does everything about her feel like a secret?" Mark's frustration flared. "Because I knew you'd react like this. You're making a big deal out of nothing, Natalie. Just let it go." Natalie clenched her fists, the weight of his words pressing down on her. "I can't let it go. Not this time. I deserve the truth, Mark." He sighed, running a hand through his hair. "Fine. I'll talk to Sylvia. Okay? If it makes you feel better, I'll ask her about the bracelet and clear this up. But you have to trust me." Natalie nodded, but deep down, she felt no relief. Trust was exactly what they no longer had. That night, she tossed and turned in bed while Mark slept soundly beside her. Her mind replayed every suspicious moment, every evasive answer. The doubt was consuming her. The next morning, Natalie decided she needed support. She reached out to Linda, hoping for reassurance. Over coffee, Natalie laid it all out. The bracelet, Mark's defensiveness, and the sinking feeling that she was being lied to. Linda listened carefully but remained cautious. "Natalie, I know this is hard, but Mark loves you. Maybe it really is just an innocent mix-up. You've always been a little protective when it comes to your marriage." Natalie bristled. "I'm not being protective, Linda. I'm trying to understand why my husband is acting like a stranger. And Sylvia, she's everywhere. It doesn't feel innocent." Linda sighed. "If you really think something is going on, maybe you should talk to someone from the church board. They might have noticed something too." That idea lingered in Natalie's mind. If Mark wasn't going to be honest with her, maybe someone else would. That afternoon, she arranged to meet with Pastor Dan, one of the senior members of the church who had known Mark for years. She hoped he could provide some insight, or at least validate her concerns. Sitting across from him in the church office, Natalie hesitated before finally speaking. "Pastor Dan, I need to ask you something. Have you noticed anything unusual about Mark lately? His relationship with Sylvia?" The pastor smiled kindly but shook his head. "Mark has always been dedicated to the church, Natalie. Sylvia's been a great help, and I think Mark sees potential in her for future leadership roles. I wouldn't read too much into it." Natalie felt a wave of disappointment wash over her. No one else saw what she saw, or maybe they just didn't want to. That night, Natalie sat alone in the living room, staring at the bracelet still resting on the counter. She had tried asking, she had tried trusting, but nothing felt right. Her world felt like it was unraveling, and she was powerless to stop it. Natalie's frustration had transformed into quiet determination. She no longer confronted Mark with accusations or asked leading questions that only resulted in him dismissing her concerns. Instead, she observed, waited, and took note of everything. The late-night calls, the hurried excuses, the stolen glances between him and Sylvia during Sunday service. It all painted a picture she could no longer ignore. Determined to uncover the truth, Natalie took steps she never imagined she would. She started by carefully going through Mark's office at home, searching for anything that might confirm her suspicions. She found receipts for dinners at upscale restaurants, dates that coincided with the nights he claimed to be in church meetings. But receipts alone weren't enough. She needed something undeniable. One afternoon, while Mark was out, Natalie placed a voice recorder in his office at the church, hidden beneath stacks of paperwork. She knew it was wrong, but she justified it by telling herself she deserved the truth after years of loyalty. Days later, she retrieved the device, her hands trembling as she pressed play. The audio confirmed everything, Mark and Sylvia's hushed voices discussing their plans to start fresh. Natalie's chest tightened as she listened. They spoke about timing, about how things needed to be handled carefully, so it wouldn't affect Mark's reputation within the church. Sylvia's voice was soft but insistent, pushing Mark to take the next step. Mark, on the other hand, seemed hesitant but still receptive to her ideas. Natalie stopped the recording and sat in silence, absorbing the crushing reality. Despite the proof in her hands, Natalie wasn't sure what to do next. She had poured her entire life into supporting Mark's ministry. Their reputation in the community was built on trust and faith, and if she exposed his affair, it wouldn't just destroy their marriage, it would shatter everything they had worked for. She began questioning herself. Could she really confront him with this and risk losing everything? Mark, meanwhile, started to sense Natalie's growing unease. His charm became more calculated, his praise of her more public. He spoke glowingly of his wonderful wife during sermons, emphasizing their shared dedication to the church and their strong partnership. To anyone watching, they appeared as the perfect couple, but behind closed doors, Natalie knew it was a desperate attempt to control the narrative. At social gatherings, Mark's words felt rehearsed, his smiles forced. He would take Natalie's hand and squeeze it tightly whenever Sylvia walked into the room, making a show of their connection for everyone to see. Natalie played along, nodding and smiling while the weight of the recording in her purse felt heavier than ever. In the midst of all this, Natalie confided in Linda again, seeking guidance. Linda, ever the loyal friend, advised her to stay strong and think carefully before making any rash decisions. You have to protect yourself, Natalie. Think about what exposing him could do, not just to you, but to the church. Natalie knew Linda meant well, but the words felt like another way of saying, stay silent. And staying silent was becoming unbearable. As the tension grew between them, Mark's patience with Natalie began to wear thin. He noticed the way she looked at him differently now, with suspicion instead of admiration. He accused her of being distant, of not supporting him the way she used to. And when Natalie countered with cold responses, Mark's frustration exploded. One evening, after yet another silent dinner filled with unspoken tension, Natalie finally confronted Mark with the recording. She played it back in their living room, letting his own words fill the air between them. Mark's face turned pale, but he quickly composed himself. So what? You're spying on me now? He scoffed, crossing his arms. Is that what our marriage has come to? Natalie stood her ground. It's come to this because you lied to me, Mark. You betrayed everything we built together. Mark's eyes darkened, his calm facade crumbling. You don't understand, Natalie. You never did. I've given everything to this church, to our life. And all you do is question me. Natalie's voice wavered, but she pressed on. I want to know the truth. Are you leaving me for her? Mark didn't answer right away. Instead, he ran a hand through his hair and muttered under his breath. Then, in a low voice filled with disdain, he said something Natalie never expected. Honestly, Natalie, I should have married someone like Sylvia in the first place. At least she supports me. The words hit like a punch to the gut. Natalie stood frozen, the weight of everything crashing down on her. The years of devotion, the sacrifices, the love she thought they shared. It all meant nothing to him. Mark turned away, as if dismissing the conversation entirely. I'm done having this argument, he said, heading for the door. Natalie sank into the chair, stunned by the depth of his cruelty. She had suspected the affair, but hearing him say those words out loud made it real in a way she wasn't prepared for. Her hands trembled as she stared at the floor, trying to figure out what to do next. That night, Natalie couldn't sleep. Her mind replayed the confrontation over and over, each word cutting deeper. The betrayal wasn't just about another woman. It was about how little she mattered to him. In the morning, Mark acted as if nothing had happened, going about his routine as usual, while Natalie watched him with a new sense of resolve. She wasn't going to let him walk away from this unscathed. She had evidence, and she had nothing left to lose. As Mark left for the church, Natalie sat at the kitchen table, staring at the voice recorder. The question remained, was she ready to destroy their carefully built life? Or would she let Mark continue to manipulate his way through it all? Natalie sat in the church pew, feeling like a stranger in the place she had called home for over 20 years. As Mark stood before the congregation, his voice steady and composed, he announced that he and Natalie were taking some time apart to focus on their faith and personal growth. The words echoed in Natalie's ears, each syllable chipping away at what little dignity she had left. She forced a smile, but inside, she was boiling with humiliation. The congregation responded with sympathetic nods and murmurs of support. To them, Mark was the dedicated, compassionate pastor they had always known. He spoke of how important it was to seek clarity in times of struggle, portraying their separation as a mutual decision based on their shared values. Natalie knew better. This was his way of rewriting the narrative, making himself the victim and positioning her as the one who needed time to heal. After the service, well-meaning churchgoers approached Natalie with encouraging words, but their pity only deepened her sense of isolation. They told her they were praying for her, that they admired her strength, and that they were sure she and Mark would find their way back to each other. Natalie could barely nod in response. How could she tell them the truth? That Mark had been lying to them all. At home, Natalie felt trapped, suffocated by the walls of the house they had shared for years. She tried to reach out to a few close friends for support, but their responses were lukewarm at best. Linda, once her most trusted confidant, advised her to forgive and move forward, saying Mark was a good man and the church needed them both. Others dismissed Natalie's claims outright, refusing to believe that Pastor Mark could ever betray his marriage vows. Natalie watched in silent agony as Sylvia's presence in the church grew stronger. She had started leading Bible study sessions, organizing charity events, and even assisting Mark with Sunday sermons. It was clear to Natalie that Sylvia was positioning herself as more than just a member of the congregation. She was carving out a permanent place in Mark's life. The sight of her laughing alongside Mark, engaging with the community, and taking on responsibilities that once belonged to Natalie felt like a slow, painful erasure of everything she had worked for. Each passing day, Natalie felt more like an outsider in her own life. She avoided church functions, unable to stomach the sight of Sylvia stepping into her role. The whispered conversations and lingering glances from other church members made it clear that rumors were circulating, and Natalie knew that Mark had carefully crafted his version of events to protect himself. But it wasn't until Natalie overheard a conversation between two church members in the grocery store that the full extent of Mark's betrayal became clear. They were casually discussing an upcoming church retreat, and Natalie froze when she heard Sylvia's name mentioned alongside Mark's. Her stomach dropped as she listened in silence. The retreat wasn't church-sanctioned. It was a weekend getaway for Mark and Sylvia under the guise of spiritual reflection. Natalie clenched the shopping cart, her hands trembling. The betrayal wasn't just personal anymore. It was public. Mark wasn't even trying to hide it. He was using the church, their community, and their shared faith as a cover for his affair. Rushing home, Natalie searched through the church's event calendar online, but there was no mention of the retreat. That confirmed it. Mark and Sylvia were lying to everyone. Rage and hurt bubbled to the surface as Natalie realized just how far they had gone to push her out and carry on their affair in plain sight. Unable to hold back any longer, Natalie confronted Mark that evening. He was sitting in his study, reading over his sermon notes, when she stormed in, slamming the door behind her. "I know about your little getaway," she said, her voice cold and steady. Mark barely looked up, his expression impassive. "Natalie, I don't know what you're talking about." Natalie stepped closer, placing the church bulletin she had printed in front of him. "Don't play dumb, Mark. I heard them talking about it. A weekend away? With Sylvia?" Mark sighed, rubbing his temples as if he were the one burdened by the situation. "You're making this into something it's not. It's a church retreat, Natalie. I thought it would be better if I handled it on my own, given everything." Natalie's jaw clenched. "You're a liar," she said through gritted teeth. "And I'm done playing this game." Mark stood up slowly, towering over her. "You need to calm down, Natalie. You're embarrassing yourself. People are talking. And it's not me they're blaming. Natalie recoiled as if she'd been slapped. He had turned everything around on her yet again, making her the one who looked unstable, paranoid, and out of control. Mark's next words cut deeper than she thought possible. The church has moved on, Natalie. Maybe you should too. That night, Natalie sat in their bedroom, staring at the framed wedding photo on her nightstand. She barely recognized the smiling couple in the picture. The love, the partnership, the faith. They were all gone now, replaced by lies, humiliation, and betrayal. She thought about the years she had devoted to supporting Mark's ministry, standing by his side through struggles, and sacrificing so much of herself to build their life together. And now, in the eyes of the church, she was just a woman who couldn't hold her marriage together. The rage simmered beneath the surface, stronger than ever before. Natalie wasn't just going to sit back and let Mark and Sylvia take everything from her. She had to do something. She had to stop them. The following morning, Natalie sat quietly in the church pew, watching Mark deliver his sermon with his usual charisma. Sylvia sat in the front row, smiling, hanging on to his every word. Natalie's fists clenched in her lap. She was done being the victim. As the congregation stood to sing the closing hymn, Natalie remained seated, her eyes locked on Mark. The betrayal, the lies, the humiliation, it all fueled the fire inside her. She didn't know exactly what she was going to do yet, but she knew one thing for certain. She wasn't going to let them win. Natalie stood in the church, her mind racing after Mark's shocking announcement to the congregation. He had told everyone they were taking time apart to focus on their faith, a carefully crafted lie that left her humiliated and isolated. The whispers had already begun, church members offering Mark sympathetic smiles while Natalie was met with pitiful glances. Sylvia had won, stepping into Natalie's place, becoming more involved in church activities, and subtly asserting her dominance. Natalie couldn't take it anymore. That evening, she followed Mark to the church, determined to force the truth out of him once and for all. She found him alone in his office, packing a few things into a box. The sight of him so calm, so unaffected, fueled the anger burning inside her. "You had no right," Natalie said, her voice trembling but firm. Mark sighed, not even looking up. "Natalie, please. We've been over this. The church supports me in this decision. You need to accept it." Natalie stepped closer. "Accept it? You humiliated me. You replaced me with her. You've lied to everyone, Mark. And for what? Some fling?" Mark finally looked up, his expression cold and distant. "It's not a fling. Sylvia understands me in ways you never did. It's time to move on." Natalie felt the weight of his words hit her like a blow. Her whole world had been built around their marriage, their shared faith, their role in the community. And now, it was crumbling, and he didn't even seem to care. Mark moved to walk past her, but Natalie blocked his way. "No, you're not walking away from this," she said, her voice steadier now. His face twisted with frustration. "Get out of my way, Natalie. You don't get to control me anymore." Natalie reached out, grabbing his arm with a force she had never used before, her mind racing with anger and betrayal. Mark pulled away sharply, stepping back toward the staircase. For a split second, Natalie didn't let go. Until she did, watching as he staggered, his balance slipping. A flicker of realization crossed his face just before he tumbled backward, his arms flailing in a futile attempt to grab hold of something. Natalie stood motionless as he fell. The silence that followed was deafening. She slowly made her way down, her heart pounding but her mind strangely clear. Kneeling beside him, she stared at his still form. "Mark," she whispered, her voice void of the panic she should have felt. She reached out but didn't need to check. She already knew. Natalie sat back on her heels, staring at him. A part of her had wanted this, hadn't she? The thought was unsettling, yet undeniable. This was her moment, her way out. And now, she needed to make sure it looked like nothing more than a tragic accident. Sylvia. This was her fault. If Sylvia had never come into their lives, none of this would have happened. Mark would still be the man she married, and their life would still be intact. Sylvia had to pay for this. Natalie stood, wiping her tears as she scanned the office. She grabbed Sylvia's scarf from the chair where she had left it earlier in the day and draped it carelessly near Mark's body. Then she sprayed a bit of Sylvia's perfume around the room, the floral scent lingering in the air. Moving quickly, she knocked over a few papers from his desk and placed a coffee cup, one of Sylvia's favorites, near the edge, making it look like she had been there just before the accident. Taking a deep breath, Natalie picked up the phone and dialed 911, forcing panic into her voice. "My husband. He fell down the stairs. I think he's gone. And I think someone was here. I found something that belongs to Sylvia Robbins." As the dispatcher responded, Natalie glanced at Mark one last time. Her heart pounded, but her face remained composed. Minutes later, the sound of approaching sirens filled the air. Natalie greeted the paramedics at the door, wrapping her arms around herself, tears streaming down her face. "It all happened so fast," she said shakily. I think Sylvia was here. He's been so stressed lately, and she just kept showing up." The officers exchanged looks, one of them stepping inside the office and immediately spotting the scarf and the perfume. Natalie watched as they put the pieces together, their focus shifting to Sylvia as the likely suspect. As Mark's body was taken away and the questions kept coming, Natalie sat quietly, playing her role. Sylvia had ruined her life. Now it was her turn to face the consequences. Paramedics arrived quickly, but there was nothing they could do. Mark was pronounced dead at the scene, and at first, authorities believed it was a tragic accident. Natalie maintained a composed demeanor, recounting how Mark had simply lost his footing. The church community rallied around her, offering condolences and prayers. However, as detectives dug deeper, cracks in Natalie's story began to emerge. Church members recalled hearing heated arguments between Natalie and Mark earlier that day, raising questions about what really happened. Investigators noticed inconsistencies in Natalie's statements, and forensic analysis of the scene suggested that the fall might not have been entirely accidental. Natalie's unease grew with each passing day as the investigation intensified. When detectives found evidence pointing to her attempts to stage the scene, Sylvia's scarf and misplaced items, they began to suspect foul play. Under mounting pressure, Natalie's carefully constructed version of events fell apart. Eventually, Natalie was charged and later sentenced to 15 years in prison. The church community, once united by faith, was left divided and shaken by the shocking scandal. What seemed like a perfect marriage had unraveled into a cautionary tale of betrayal, desperation, and irreversible choices.